Do you remember when you could tell what church someone belonged to just by the songs they sang? When the hymnal was worn soft from generations of hands turning the same pages, and the melody that rose from a Sunday morning congregation carried a weight that settled in your chest and stayed there for the rest of the week. In the 1960s and 1970s, churches across America sang from a shared songbook that bound communities together across denominations, races, and state lines. Those hymns were not just songs, they were prayers set to music, theology taught through melody, and emotional anchors that connected families to the generations who had sung the same words before them. But somewhere between then and now, projection screens replaced hymnals, praise bands replaced choirs and organs, and an entire catalog of sacred music quietly vanished from Sunday mornings. Studies show the average contemporary worship song has a lifespan of just 3 to 4 years before it is replaced by the next one. The hymns we are about to revisit lasted for centuries. Today, we are exploring 20 church songs from the 1960s and 1970s that have all but disappeared from modern worship. And if you grew up hearing these, the first few words of each one will take you somewhere you have not been in a very long time. Let's start with Softly and Tenderly Jesus is Calling. Written by Will Thompson in 1880, this hymn reached its peak in the mid-20th century when it was sung during altar calls in nearly every Protestant church in America. The opening notes from the organ would begin, low and gentle, while the preacher extended his invitation for anyone in the congregation to come forward. The melody was deliberately soft, almost a whisper set to music, designed to create space for the most vulnerable decision a person could make in public. Families watched from their pews as someone stepped into the aisle, and walked toward the front of the church, while the congregation sang them forward with words about coming home. The song carried a tenderness that modern worship rarely attempts, a gentleness that assumed the listener was fragile and that God was patient enough to wait. When altar calls began disappearing from services in the 1980s and 1990s, the song lost its natural home. Without the moment it was designed to accompany, it drifted out of regular rotation and into memory, where it lives now in the hearts of people who remember what it felt like to hear that melody and know someone in the room was about to change their life. Just As I Am Without One Plea was the companion to every Billy Graham crusade and every small-town revival that followed his model. Written by Charlotte Elliott in 1835, the hymn became so closely associated with the invitation to accept Christ that hearing its opening bars created an almost involuntary emotional response in anyone who had ever sat through a revival service. The verses were sung slowly, one at a time, with pauses between them that stretched the moment and gave people time to wrestle with whatever was holding them in their seats. Some churches sang all 6 verses, and the silence between each one grew heavier as the invitation continued. When children watched adults weep, teenagers gripped the pew in front of them, feeling something they could not name pulling at them from the inside. When crusade-style evangelism declined and churches moved toward less confrontational worship formats, the hymn lost its stage. It is still printed in hymnals that sit unopened in storage closets, but the sound of a congregation singing it during a live altar call has become something that belongs to a generation that is slowly leaving the room. Blessed Assurance, Jesus is Mine was written by Fanny Crosby in 1873, a blind woman who composed over 8,000 hymns and whose melodies carried black and white congregations alike through the most important moments of the 20th century. The opening declaration, bold and certain, and set a tone that everything following would reinforce. This was not a hymn about questioning or searching. It was a hymn about knowing, about standing on something so solid that doubt could not reach it. Choirs sang it with full voices, and congregations joined in on the chorus with an energy that made the walls vibrate. The song appeared at funerals, weddings, baptisms, and ordinary Sunday mornings with equal power. Modern worship has moved towards songs of longing and searching rather than declaration and certainty, which has left confident hymns like this one without a natural place in contemporary set lists. The Old Rugged Cross was composed by George Bennard in 1913 and became one of the most beloved hymns in American church history during the mid-century decades. The melody was deliberately slow and mournful, matching lyrics that described clinging to a symbol of suffering and sacrifice with language that was both graphic and deeply personal. Congregations sang it with the reverence reserved for songs that touched the central event of the Christian faith. Elderly members often closed their eyes during this hymn, their lips moving through words they had memorized decades earlier, the melody carrying them backward through every Sunday morning they had ever lived. Sweet Hour of Prayer, written by William Walford in 1845, was the hymn that made prayer itself feel sacred before a single word was spoken to God. The melody moved slowly, almost meditatively, creating a musical space that felt like kneeling, even if you were still standing. Churches sang it before corporate prayer times, using the music to transition the congregation from the noise of gathering into the quiet of communion. When structured prayer times disappeared from most services, the song lost its function and faded with it. Pass Me Not, O Gentle Savior was written by Fanny Crosby in 1868 and carried a desperation in its lyrics that modern worship songs rarely express. The plea to not be overlooked, to not be passed by while others received blessing, spoke to a rawness of spiritual need that resonated powerfully in Black churches and revival settings throughout the 1960s and 1970s. The song acknowledged that a person could be in the presence of God and still feel invisible, still feel unworthy of attention. Deacons would line this hymn during devotional services, then their lone voices carrying the verse before the congregation joined on the chorus with a fullness that transformed individual pleading into communal prayer. Leaning on the Everlasting Arms, written in 1887 by Elisha Hoffman, was the hymn that sounded like what safety felt like. The chorus was so simple and so deeply comforting that children learned it before they could read, absorbing the melody through repetition and the physical memory of standing in a pew between their parents while the whole church swayed together. The song described a closeness with God that felt physical, like being held, and for many people it was the first theological concept they ever understood, not through words but through the feeling the music created. Which of these songs can you still sing from memory without looking at a single word? In the Garden, written by C. Austin Miles in 1913, described an intimate encounter with Jesus that felt more like poetry than theology. The imagery of walking alone in a garden while dew was still on the roses and hearing a voice so gentle it could be mistaken for birdsong created a private, almost secret relationship with the divine. Grandmothers especially loved this hymn, requesting it at funerals and singing it softly while working around the house. What a Friend We Have in Jesus, written by Joseph Scriven in 1855, turned to God with the familiarity usually reserved for the closest human relationship. The lyrics acknowledged that people carried burdens they never shared with anyone, and offered prayer as the solution that required no appointment and no explanation. Shall We Gather at the River, written by Robert Lowry in 1864, painted a picture of heaven that was specific enough to almost see. The river, the throne, the gathering of everyone who had gone before created an image that elderly church members held on to during their final years as something real, waiting for them. His Eye is on the Sparrow, written by Sevilla Martin in 1905, became the anthem of Black churches where suffering was constant, and the promise that God was watching even the smallest, most overlooked creature meant everything to people who felt overlooked themselves. Ethel Waters made it famous in 1951, and for 2 decades it appeared in nearly every Black church service. Modern gospel has moved towards songs of triumph and empowerment, leaving behind the quiet vulnerability this hymn expressed. Standing on the Promises, written by Russell Kelso Carter in 1886, was a declaration hymn that congregations sang with feet stomping and hands clapping. The rhythm was almost martial, like a marching song for spiritual warfare, and the repetition of the chorus built an energy that modern praise choruses attempt but rarely achieve with the same theological weight. Bringing in the sheaves, written by Knowles Shaw in 1874, used agricultural imagery that resonated with rural congregations who knew exactly what it meant to sow seed and wait for harvest. As America urbanized, the metaphor lost its visceral connection, and the song gradually disappeared from churches where no one had ever held a sheaf of wheat. Blessed Be the Tie That Binds, written by John Fawcett in 1782, closed services across America. For generations, the congregation would stand, join hands across the aisles, and sing about the bond that held them together despite everything that happened outside those walls. The physical act of holding hands with strangers while singing created a moment of connection that no closing prayer could replicate. Precious Lord, Take My Hand, written by Thomas A. Dorsey in 1932 after the death of his wife and newborn son, carried a grief so personal that singing it felt like intruding on someone's most private moment. Martin Luther King Jr. requested it be played at a rally just moments before he was assassinated, and Mahalia Jackson's rendition at his funeral cemented it in history. The song has largely left regular rotation in modern churches, replaced by contemporary gospel that favors celebration over lament. I Surrender All, written in 1896 by Judson Van Deventer, was the hymn of total submission, every verse adding another layer of yielding until nothing remained held back. Churches sang it during consecration services where members rededicated their lives, and the repetition of the word all carried a weight that intensified with each verse. Victory in Jesus, written by Eugene Bartlett in 1939, was one of the last hymns he composed before a stroke ended his musical career. The triumphant melody and narrative lyrics told the story of salvation like a three-act play, moving from hearing about Jesus to believing, and finally to receiving the promise. Churches that once sang every verse now rarely include it in worship planning. Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing, written by Robert Robinson in 1758, contained a lyric that haunted anyone who sang it honestly. The phrase, prone to wander, Lord, I feel it, prone to leave the God I love, acknowledged a spiritual restlessness that most worship songs avoid confronting. The raw honesty made it both beloved and uncomfortable, which may explain why modern worship prefers songs that resolve the tension rather than sitting inside it. Our We Shall Overcome transcended church walls to become the anthem of the civil rights movement. But its roots were in Black worship services where congregations linked arms, swayed together, and sang about a victory they could not yet see but refused to stop believing in. The song belonged to a specific historical moment, and as that moment receded, the urgency that made it powerful faded from regular worship, even though the need for its message never disappeared. Near the Cross, written by Fanny Crosby in 1869, was the hymn that brought everything back to the simplest, most central image in the Christian faith. The melody was gentle, the words were plain, and the request was nothing more than to stay close to the place where suffering and salvation met. In an era of complex worship production, sophisticated lighting, and concert-quality sound, the simplicity of this hymn no longer fits the aesthetic that modern churches have built. But simplicity was the point. The song was never meant to impress. It was meant to bring a person to their knees quietly, without spectacle, in the presence of something too sacred for performance. And for the generations who sang it with their eyes closed and their hands folded in their laps, it did exactly that, every single time, without ever needing anything more than a voice and a willing heart. Thanks for joining us on this trip down memory lane. If any of these songs brought back a melody you have not heard in years, but can still sing every word, drop a comment sharing which one hit you the hardest. Hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss another journey into the moments that shaped who we are.